Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's talk. Today we have Dr. Vinayak Sinha, who is an associate professor at the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department of IISER Mohali. Dr. Sinha did his MTech from IIT Delhi, and then he went on to do his PhD from the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry at Mainz in Germany. And then he continued for a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute before joining IISER Mohali as a faculty. Dr. Sinha is highly accomplished. He has gotten many awards, some of which one is he's a Nasi Scopus Young Scientist Awardee. He has also gotten the Best Teacher Award from IISER Mohali. He also holds many international distinctions. For example, he has served as the Scientific Steering Committee member and the co-chair, the first Indian co-chair, I should say, for the Integrated Land Ecosystem Atmosphere Processes Study Global Research Project under the Future Earth. And he's also a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the International Commission on Global Atmospheric Chemistry and Air Pollution. His main research interest, of course, is in atmospheric chemistry. And today he'll be talking to us about something very interesting and relevant about one of the things I'm assuming would be about the problem of the smog over north of India. And that's not going to be the only thing. Before I invite Dr. Sinha to take over, two requests. One is, we will take questions at the end of the talk. Second, those who are on Zoom, please use the raise hand feature. We will allow you to ask the question. Those who are watching on YouTube, you can type in your question in the chat box and we'll pick up your questions from there. Dr. Sinha.
Thank you very much, Professor Prasad, for this kind opportunity. And thank you also for the very kind introduction. So I welcome all the viewers who have tuned in. Very good morning to all of you. So much of what I'll be showing today are actually measurements and experimental discoveries that have been acquired using an atmospheric observatory, which you see here, the blue box on your slide. And I live and work in a very beautiful place, as you can see, when the air is clean. So that is extra motivation for me to ensure that all of us are able to breathe such clean air, where you can see the Shivalik Mountains from our site in Mohali. Right. So as you can see, the title I've chosen is Atmospheric Chemistry and Air Pollution, Brew What We Breathe. In essence, this simply means that both atmospheric chemistry and air pollution make what we are inhaling. Okay, so let's start. I have highlighted these keywords, and let's start with some very basic level of understanding, probably primary school, so that we can all build up. And then what I shall do is introduce you to a few key concepts in terms of processes that are extremely important whenever we want to figure out why the air quality is turning bad, what is causing the air pollution. Okay, so a very common starting point, basic starting point, is actually Wikipedia. And Wikipedia, let's start with air pollution. Wikipedia defines air pollution as the presence of substances in the atmosphere that are harmful to the health of humans and other living beings or cause damage to climate or to materials. So I am sure that most of us are actually aware of what air pollution is. However, what I'd like to stress on here in this definition, which may not always be registered when you read this definition, is it clarifies that these are substances that are harmful. And for those of you who know enough of the world, anything is harmful when it exceeds a certain exposure threshold, right? Even water that we drink about 2 to 3 liters per day, if there's too much of it into our lungs, then we can drown. So similarly, it is important to keep in mind that the presence of chemicals per se in the atmosphere is not necessarily harmful. It really depends on what type of chemicals we have, what their toxic properties are, and even there, how much of those we are inhaling when we breathe. Okay. And then the rest, I think you are all fairly familiar. If most of you are living in a developing country, developing region, then you know that air pollution really is made up of a cocktail of both gases and what we call aerosol particles. So I think it's important to clarify first what the meaning of aerosol particle is. So aerosol particles are liquid or solid particles that are suspended in a carrier gas. In the case of the atmosphere, the carrier gas is mainly nitrogen, right? 78% of it is nitrogen. And then what is also important to register in terms of this definition is they have negligible terminal fall speed. Okay, so this otherwise you could take a duster, it's a solid object, or your mobile phone and simply suspend it in the air. That wouldn't make it an aerosol particle. It doesn't have negligible fall speed. The third very important thing, which is generally not recognized by most even experts, is that we are talking these solid or liquid particles, they should be in physical and chemical equilibrium with the carrier gas. Okay, so, and then I'm sure many of you have heard about biological molecules. So in essence, the cocktail comprises of both gases and aerosol particles and biological emissions. Okay. And the effects, I don't think I need to spend too much time on that. But I'd just like to stress that it's not just human health that is affected by bad air quality, but it's also our food security. It's also our buildings, because bad air is not good for crop yields. So let me show you an image which I took from the internet. This is the source of a giant pair of artificial lungs that have been installed in Sir Ganga Ram Hospital, Delhi. The dates are here. And what you can see is this is actually an artificial lung. And in this artificial lung, you can see that just 10 days of the lung processing air that people in Delhi normally breathe makes it graphically look quite bad. And this begs the question, how much of air does each one of us inhale every day? So for this, one can do a very simple calculation. School kids, I urge you to do it uh, in your brain. So on average, a person breathes in and breathes out about 20 times per minute. And the volume of air that is exchanged, the so-called tidal volume, is about half a liter. So per minute, we inhale and exhale about 10 liters minimum. Sports athletes would even do much higher. Okay. And then if you calculate how many minutes they are in a day, that's 60 minutes in an hour and 24 hours, then you will come up with a calculation that's far more than 11,000 liters of air. And now, as you can imagine, whatever gases or aerosol particles are there in each breath of air that we take, how does actually our lung help us? So the lung has these air sacs called alveoli, which are essentially the portion through which the dissolved gases like oxygen, which are in the inhaled breath, they manage to diffuse through that, and then they are transferred to the capillary. And the blood capillaries then transfer this oxygenated blood to our heart, which pumps it to all the organs. And as you know, each human cell needs oxygen. So this is something, therefore, where it's a very fundamental right to living to have good, clean air. Essentially, what I wanted to stress. So now that we are clear about air pollution, what is atmospheric chemistry? So atmospheric chemistry is a branch, a very multidisciplinary branch of science, interdisciplinary, where in one sentence, one would say, this is the study of all the factors that can control the concentrations of substances present in the atmosphere. What this means is that if you have a substance X, so here this is being illustrated with a atmospheric box. If you imagine the entire atmosphere to be a single box, a simplification just for illustration, then you can see that this means we should know about the sources of X, the sinks of X, the chemical reactions that X can undergo within this box, and how X can be transported into and out of this box. Okay, so this is illustrated here essentially as emissions of X, production of X, chemical loss of X, and then deposition of X. And mathematically, what atmospheric chemists do is they use this so-called basic differential equation, which is referred to as the continuity equation, where we simply mathematically parameterize the number of molecules of X per unit volume of air, how they change with time. Issue. Yeah. And then you can see that we essentially have terms on the right-hand side of the equation, which take into account all these processes. So this is the important thing that I'd like to stress on in today's talk. Please remember that there are more processes than just direct emissions, which affect the concentration of a substance in the atmosphere. So now if we go to the real atmosphere, then it turns out the real atmosphere is not just one box. It's actually many different boxes. It has layers. And I'm sure some of you would be familiar with these terms of troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere. And essentially why these layers form is whenever you have hot air sitting on top of cold air. So you see this is the temperature profile, and generally it decreases as you go from the surface to higher altitude. But then there comes a point where there is an inversion in this trend. So what you have then is hot air sitting on cold air. Since cold air is heavier than hot air, it does not have a tendency to further rise upwards due to buoyancy. And therefore, you form a sort of lid. Okay. Now, most of our 99.9% of all the molecules present in air are within the stratosphere and troposphere, which extends to about 50-kilometer height from the surface. In that, 90% of all of them are in the troposphere. And just wanted to stress that when you hear about ozone depletion being a bad thing, that's actually the ozone present between 20 and 50 kilometers. But whereas where we live, where we encounter our air quality and weather phenomena and grow our food crops, that's the lowermost part of the troposphere. So let's look at that particular part, which is actually relevant for the air pollution. Now, when it comes to the processes, I mentioned to you that air motion plays a very big role in determining how emissions that are emitted at the surface accumulate within the lowermost part of the atmosphere. And it turns out, so here is where I would like to introduce the concept of what is called the planetary boundary layer height. This is actually a very key controller and modulator of the concentration levels of different substances present in the air. And the remarkable thing about it is that this varies quite significantly between day and night, even at the same place, and of course, also seasonally over the same region. Okay. So formally, why this occurs in very layman's terms, easy to understand, is because this is driven by air motion associated with the surface temperature of the earth. So how much of heat energy is thermals are emitted from the surface of the earth. This changes between day and night depending on how much radiation and heating occurs, how much energy there is. And the interesting thing in terms of the outcome, we only need to bother about it for your air pollution discussion today on how this affects the concentration. So since this is the height of the box, so to say, into which emissions accumulate during the day. So here, for illustration, I made a cartoon, which you see morning, the height of the box is somewhere around here, a few 100 meters. Afternoon, at the same place, this box can grow to greater than 1,000 meters. Okay. So what happens is whatever is emitted here at the surface, this warm air rises upwards. And since it rises upwards, air from the sides comes to take its place. So there is a well mixed box of air, so to say. And this is what is effectively referred to as the planetary boundary layer. Now, as you can see here, if you have the same emission strength, let's say 100 molecules of a substance being emitted within this box, both in the afternoon and the evening time, then just due to the change in the height of the box, namely the planetary boundary layer, and here you see that can be a factor of 10, your concentration can change by a factor of 10 if there are no other processes at play. So this is a very, very important aspect in air pollution and air quality, which the common people need to be made aware of. Emissions are much more easy for us to relate to because we see things burning, we see smoke going up, but this is nonetheless also a very important process. So now how does it vary seasonally over Delhi? Let's look at the tendencies in different seasons. So here you see variation in the planetary boundary layer height, namely just understand it as the height of the box into which the surface emissions accumulate, and a term we refer to as the ventilation coefficient. This term is a very easy term to understand. It is simply the product of the height of the box, namely the height of the planetary boundary layer, multiplied by the average wind speed. Okay, so therefore, the higher the ventilation coefficient we see here, you can see its units, the higher will be the tendency of the pollutants to not accumulate because they simply get blown away. And now let us look at the seasons. So generally in monsoon season, most of North India and indeed most of all of India does not seem to encounter the same level of air pollution. Rather, air can be quite clean. What happens between monsoon and the winter, and you see here post-monsoon as well, is that actually because of the seasonality of this, because of the way the planetary boundary layer height, evolves, you actually have a decrease of by a factor of 2. So here the ventilation coefficient is around 6 in the middle of the day. Evening times, you can see it's even lower, as you would expect, the diurnal evolution. But by winter, the average ventilation coefficient reduces to half the value. So just like I explained a few minutes ago, for the same emissions, suppose nothing changes between monsoon and winter or after monsoon, in the post-monsoon, in the autumn, you would still expect an increase in the atmospheric concentrations. Okay, so this process is very important to account for. Now, let me show you a nice video. Even within the same season, this is actually taken from NASA's webpage. You see the reference here, and it's showing the daily change in the planetary boundary layer height over Los Angeles city for a full month. So it will run for about 30 seconds. And what you can see is both the day and night time. So the rising as the day progresses. Los Angeles is a coastal city. So you have the ocean. Over the ocean, because the surface heating is different from that over land, you have a different boundary layer height. And therefore, you can see even within the same season, this is a very, very highly variable parameter, right? So now that we have understood about one of the factors in addition to emissions that control at ambient concentrations of pollutants, let us now look at some real data that has been acquired over Northwest India. And this is data for the year 2012. This has been acquired thanks to the students of IISER Mohali using the atmospheric observatory I introduced you to at the start of the talk. So I have purposefully selected very simple air pollutants. There are, of course, many more. I shall illustrate some more disturbing ones later in the talk. But PM 2.5, I'm sure by now nobody needs introduction to this in India. And what you can see here is that about 60%, so this is what we refer to as the calendar plot. So about 60% of the days in a year, the ambient air quality standard is not complied with, it's in excess. And that's harmful for health because all these air quality standards are determined very, very carefully. Okay, so if it's really above that value, threshold value of 60 microgram per meter cube, the 24-hour average, then it really means that there is a risk to our health because of this exposure. But what I'd like to also stress here is it's not just the PM 2.5, it's also gases like ozone. And ozone is by itself a pulmonary irritant. This can cause reactive oxygen species to be formed and cause inflammation of tissues. It's bad for crops. And here you see that the numbers for ozone exceedance are also quite comparable to PM 2.5. However, because of the time of the year during which these exceedances occur, okay, there is a little bit less attention that ozone receives compared to PM 2.5. So now that we have looked at the planetary boundary layer height as a modulator, let's look at the chemistry that can occur in the atmosphere. So in terms of the chemistry, you have to understand that, and I can share my experience with you. I started out as an analytical chemist. And when I was first told about atmospheric chemistry, my first reaction was, wow, that must be pretty boring. Why? Because 78% of all the molecules are nitrogen, an inert gas, carrier gas. 21% is oxygen, which by itself does not really react unless there are more reactive species already present in the atmosphere, namely radicals. So then my eyes opened as I started doing it. So let me walk you through this overview of how the chemical transformations in the atmosphere actually end up producing a large number of the air pollutants we all suffer from. And you can see their impacts, societal impacts, of course, on the right-hand side in terms of air quality, but also rainfall, okay, and climate. So first off, the emissions, as I said, can be both from natural sources and anthropogenic sources. So natural sources like the forest vegetation, they also emit a reactive class of what we say volatile organic compounds or gases called terpenes. Biomass burning natural wildfires have been in existence even before mankind on this planet, and volcanic eruptions. And then, of course, we humans, in order to meet our energy and transportation needs, have also put in a lot of other sources that are not normally present. So these are referred to as the anthropogenic sources. Now, once the primary emissions, so anything that is a primary air pollutant is simply that which is emitted directly into the atmosphere. So once those gases end up in the atmosphere, and they can also be directly aerosol particles, then there are oxidants in the atmosphere, namely the hydroxyl radical, which in the presence of oxygen converts them into more oxidized forms. So in this oxidation process, you add an oxygen atom to the precursor molecule, to the primary emission, and thereby you make it a bit heavier. Not only that, let's say the initial molecule emitted was something like benzene, which is normally hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. It doesn't dissolve easily in water. Then, because of this oxidation process, it's converted to something that is a bit more water liking, like hydrophilic, we say, like phenol. And then when it rains, we've all experienced how the washout entails removal of many of these soluble compounds. So this, in a sense, the hydroxyl radical is how the air keeps itself clean. It's the detergent of the atmosphere. But in this oxidation process, not everything is hunky-dory. So ozone, the criteria air pollutant in the surface, lowermost part of the troposphere that I talked about, pre-industrial levels of this, before we really had large-scale technology and emissions driving it, associated with it, the levels were about less than 30 ppb on the planet. Today, frequently, where human beings live on continental regions, it even exceeds 100 ppb. You saw over Northwest India. Los Angeles, for example, has had frequent photochemical air pollution episodes where the main ingredient is actually ozone. And there it has even been reported to reach up to 200 ppb on occasions. Okay. And how is this formed? This is purely the child of chemistry. It's not emitted directly in any significant amount. So you need to, therefore, if you want to control this, know about the precursors, namely nitrogen oxides, and also the other molecules that fuel its formation. Okay. Then when we talk about aerosol particles, PM2.5, we've all just heard about it and discussed it. Now, a large chunk of the PM2.5. So what is PM2.5? It's simply the mass concentration, the mass of all the aerosol particles that have an aerodynamic equivalent diameter of less than 2.5 micron. So what does this mean for the kids out there? You take a meter and then you divide a meter's length by a million times. Then you get to 1 micron, 1 micrometer. Now, you may wonder, how is it that in the real world, particles come in all sorts of shapes and also in different densities? Then how can we think of a diameter for aerosol particles? Because not all of them are spherical, right? So essentially, when we are comparing, when we are referring to PM2.5, we are referring to all those particles whose movement in air mimics that of a perfect spherical particle with a density of 1 gram per centimeter cube. Okay. And why is this important? Because depending on their aerodynamic properties, that is how they move in air, that determines how deeply they can lodge within the human body when we inhale them. That determines the size, also determines to a large extent how long they'll float around in the air. So just to complete this, the PM2.5 problem that we have in many developing countries, including North India, is actually, so that's simply a bulk parameter. It's the total mass, but it doesn't tell you what that mass is made up of. So the units are microgram per meter cube of air. Now, if you look at the chemical composition of that, scientists in India and abroad have already shown that most of it is actually comprises of what we call secondary organic aerosol. Okay, so this is just like ozone, aerosol particle that is formed in the atmosphere through chemistry, through atmospheric chemistry. And then, of course, you can also have this slow oxidation, just like you burn a hydrocarbon and you get carbon dioxide and water vapor. The atmosphere, in some sense, also for molecules where the oxidation products remain in the gas phase, it also ends up adding a little bit to the CO2, which is a little bit insignificant compared to the primary emission of CO2 from fossil fuel burning. And now, just to give you a sense of the scale and magnitude here, what a terrific job the atmosphere's chemistry does. So the estimate of how much total reactive material in the form of these gases is released into the atmosphere comes to about 1300 teragram per year. And just to give you an example of this teragram unit, we have a population of 1 billion, so that's 10 to the power 9. If you would give 1 kilogram of any substance to each individual, then you would come up with only 1 teragram, that's 10 to the power 12 gram. And here we're talking about 1300 teragram carbon. So the reason why you don't hear about this accumulating in the atmosphere like carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases is because it's simply removed, converted into forms that are more easily removed from the atmosphere. And how many total number of compounds are we talking about here? So this ranges from 100,000 to 10,000 that have been detected in the Earth's atmosphere. And again, to put it in perspective, before 1952, in terms of VOCs, there were only two that were thought to be present. That's methane and formaldehyde. So the consequences we know, I will not talk too much about it. We know this, but just to emphasize again how this can maybe affect the rainfall. So if you have these particles that have different colors, we all know black objects can absorb more, but we also form a lot of compounds that are brown in color, which also have light absorbing property. If these particles, and also black carbon, if these particles get lodged within clouds, then they can absorb heat and prematurely evaporate the cloud. And thereby, it can affect the hydrological cycle too. Right. So I think now we've covered enough basics. Now it's time to show you some more data. So this is data of PM 2.5. You see the units microgram per meter cube. And you see on the x-axis, the hour of the day, again measured over Northwest India by Harshita, who's a student from IISER. And this is winter time. So what you see here is this diurnal evolution where you have a sort of bimodal feature in the trace, right? There is a morning peak and there is an evening peak and an afternoon minima. So why does this happen? Now that we all have the basics, it's very easy to interpret at least part of the reason. So part of the reason is because of the planetary boundary layer height. It's simply the dilution effect. The other reason is there may be more increased emissions in the early morning here and in the evening due to traffic emission activity, right? When people go to office or return from office. So just to give you an idea. Now, how powerful chemistry can be is illustrated by the next graph, where you see ozone. And 50 ppb is roughly the national ambient air quality standard. So this is in summertime, the other was in winter. So that's one of the challenges of air pollution. It's very important to know what the main air pollutant is, because that can change between which time of the year you are actually looking at air pollution. So here you see that despite this dilution effect of the planetary boundary layer, simply the production, the chemistry is pumping so much of, making so much of ozone in the air that you can get up to 70 ppb hourly average concentrations in summer. Okay. So now how do we tackle air pollution? How do we go about making sense of what emission sources are affecting an atmospheric environment? So for that, we behave like a detective. An atmospheric chemist in some sense is just like a detective. So what we do there is we use molecules that contain information about them, in them, about the sources that emitted them. So for example, if you have an air mass where you measure the concentration of the compound acetonitrile, if you have elevated levels of acetonitrile, okay, this can come from wood burning is one type of biomass burning, leaf litter burning is another, okay, garbage fires can also emit depending on the biomass, then it immediately yields information that that air parcel has emissions due to biomass burning. This is very important for our work because, as you can imagine, the stubble burning that all of you are, I'm pretty sure most of you are aware of that, that is nothing but biomass that's made of carbon, hydrogen. The fuel biomass is always made up of just carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and some of the other elements, right? So inefficient combustion of that breaks bonds within them, and then it releases molecules like acetonitrile. And the good thing is acetonitrile from most fossil fuel sources is not emitted in sufficient or significant amounts so that you can actually use it as a unique chemical tracer for biomass burning emission. Then if you talk about marine air, phytoplankton normally produce this molecule called dimethyl sulfide. If you talk about trees and vegetation, which is a natural emission source, then terpenes like isoprene and pinene, they are good traces. If you talk about photochemistry, chemical transformations, then these oxygenated VOCs, simple ones, they are also a good indicator, but they can also be emitted directly from biomass burning. And then when you talk about the more health relevant ones, for example, benzene, which is known to be a human carcinogen at just 1.6 ppb of annual average mixing ratio exposure. Okay, and toluene. So these already have a lot of carbon atoms to start with. So 6 and more. And so when they get oxidized, then the oxidation product is not as volatile as these gases, and it partitions to the aerosol phase, so it can form a lot of secondary organic aerosol. And many of these are emitted in large amounts from industry and traffic. So this is really mainly from anthropogenic sources. So as you can imagine, 10,000 to 100,000, thankfully, we don't have to deal with even 1,000. Most of the time, 100 or so make up about 99.999% of both the reactivity and the mass of the reactive material, which forms the secondary pollutants. So when I got this wonderful opportunity to join IISER Mohali in 2011, thanks to the then directors and subsequent directors and my colleagues there, some very senior colleagues who were very, very helpful in facilitating this, we were able to actually set up a world-class facility. And here you don't need to read all of this. This is a slide just to impress all the kids out there that we have a lot of toys in our lab which when you grow up, you can come and play with, and which are able to measure all these different myriad of molecules. Okay. So this is a MET station, which also tells us when we are measuring the chemical parameter, what the provenance of where the air came from, what the temperature is, how much light is there, how much humidity is there, and so on. Okay. And also greenhouse gases. So now let's look at how we apply these tools, right? After all, what good is it to have toys if you can't really use them? So this is where our lab has pioneered a new approach for source apportionment studies, where you look at the quantitative, you quantify how much is coming from each source, and you also identify the sources that are active. So here you see a picture of a person who doesn't seem to be up to much good. So this could be, for example, a person who's wearing a mask and then is out to, it's maybe Halloween time, out to scare some of the kids or look goofy. And how would you stop this person from continuing his antics? Well, you would first have to identify him, right? Or her. And so if you would remove the mask, you would find probably somebody like me. I like to do such things once in a while. Now, let's take the analogy to the ambient atmospheric environment, where most of us are able to actually see or smell the pollution. So here you see a visual like image of a plume, okay, which you don't know it. You know it's smoke, it's bad, but you don't know what's in it, and you don't know where it came from. So sometimes only you may be very lucky and you may see a power plant or a rusty old vehicle that's emitting this, in which case you can immediately act on that particular offending polluter and put restrictions. But most often you don't really know what has been emitted because the smoke has traveled far away from where it was emitted. So then what do? That's where, my friends, we are able to use these molecular traces. And just to show you the power of that, here you don't bother about the different, just think of this as one class of chemicals. This is the acetonitrile biomass burning tracer, chemical tracer for biomass burning. And this is another class of chemicals, right? Oxygenated VOCs. And you can see here some of the more common sources that affect our air quality at this time of the year: paddy residue burning, wheat residue burning, leaf litter burning, garbage burning, fossil fuel burning. Just by measuring the molecules present in the air, and we don't know what emitted it, by comparing it with the fingerprints of sources, we are able to identify what sources were affecting the chemical composition and therefore adversely deteriorating the air quality, right? So this is pretty neat. And now we actually used this particular approach when the odd even rule was implemented in Delhi. I'm sure you all remember that was around 2015 December, 2016 January. And you can see that using this, we were able to actually show in this paper that the traffic emissions, everybody sort of knew by measuring. The Central Pollution Control Board measures, PM 2.5 bulk parameter, measures some of the other air pollutants, but they can come from a variety of sources. Okay, so it was not clear why the pollution did not go down, but they could say that the pollution didn't really reduce. We, with our chemical traces, were able to use molecules that are emitted specifically from traffic and not from other sources, and show that the reason why it didn't come down was because the most offending vehicles, the highest polluters in that, were actually petrol two-wheeler vehicles. So these are use very primitive technology, engine technology, and there was no restriction on their flying on the roads. The petrol four-wheeler, so these are basically different molecules. So these are, just directly measured from the exhaust of these vehicles, the tailpipe exhaust. So you can see they have very different fingerprints, just like DNA fingerprinting. We can use chemical fingerprinting for these pollution sources. But the important thing is, for the odd even rule, the reason why it didn't work out is because there was no restriction on them, and there were a lot of them, many of them, the number also increased. And whereas for the petrol four-wheelers, actually there were restrictions, half only could fly. But then what people did was, because the public transport was not so convenient, they started traveling to their office before the 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. restrictions were in place. And if you travel before 8 a.m., then you're actually emitting into the atmosphere when the planetary boundary layer height is much more shallower, which leads to even higher concentrations. Okay, so this was very important for policy. So this is just an example to show you what great lengths we go to collect our fingerprints. And then we also found, using these traces, uh, process of how during the fog season, which will be coming up pretty soon, if not already started, if it hasn't already started in Delhi. So what we did here was actually we measured again the chemical traces, which could help us distinguish between these three different types of sources. And what we found is that during the fog, one of the extra reasons why the air quality turns worse is because as temperatures dip during fog, then in order to keep warm, people start burning more and more material that is combustible in the open streets. Since this burning is so inefficient, it emits a large number of these toxic chemicals into the air. And so therefore, in other words, the fog itself induces an emission trigger, which reduces the air quality. So the colder it gets, the more you burn, the more there is emission, the more the air quality goes down, the more that can in fact affect the life cycle of fog. Okay. And then again, here you only need to look at this simply to emphasize what I wanted to emphasize is that whatever biomass you take, okay, when you break it down into its building blocks, it is typically made up of only three different types of chemical units: cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Okay. And you can look at the structure, they differ significantly. And what happens when you burn is essentially you're breaking bonds that exist in these structural units, in these building blocks. And when the bonds break through, there are lots of permutation, combination, and depending on the flame chemistry, you can emit a cesspool of compounds. So more than 500 compounds have been detected in biomass burning smoke. That is why it is so very different and so very harmful compared to the more traditional, let's say a power plant plume, which already has efficient scrubbers and only generally emits mostly carbon dioxide. So now if you zoom in into the breadbasket of India, which is this northwest region of Punjab and Haryana, this is where IISER Mohali is. I just wanted to briefly show you some results of paddy stubble burning. So this is a region where you get air most of the year from the northwest, and then in the monsoon season from the southeast. We measure all the time, so we can capture all of that. And the region has undergone great transformation. Why? Because, in 1965, compared to 1965, the amount of area under paddy and wheat cultivation and the crop yield, the amount of area has increased by more than a factor of 4, and the crop yields have increased by a factor of 10. So this is great. Kudos to the farmers who ensured India's food security. Because I know from my parents that before 1970, India was not really as self-sufficient in food security as it is today. But this has come with the cost that most of the farming is mechanized. And when they use the mechanized farming, they use this machine called the combine harvester. The trouble with this machine is it removes the the rice grain, but it leaves the stalk, a few meters of it in the ground, the stubble. And then in order to get rid of the stubble, the farmers simply set it on fire because they are pressed in time. And then the smoke, I've already told you what all can come out, why so many things can come out from it, nasty stuff. Okay. And then in addition, we also have a lot of trees, greenery. So these natural terpene emissions, they all mix, a nice cocktail. Then there is oxidation, you cook it in the air, and then you can form secondary inorganic aerosol, secondary organic aerosol, ozone, so all your PM 2.5. And then what is very, very tragic is normally wheat follows after paddy. And this bad air is actually quite bad for the wheat that grows after. There is a lot of crop yield loss. Okay, so here you can see visually that the air grown in air that has just normal level of ozone can be pretty stunted, whereas this is clean. So government is making a lot of efforts. Many agencies are seized of the matter. They've tried to replace this machine with this machine. Happy Seeder will simply source the wheat seed through the rice stalk, so you don't have to burn it. So just to tell you how great this activity is, probably you've seen it in the newspapers too. You can, using satellites that NASA has put up in space, you can detect as thermal anomalies the fire activity. So you see the post-monsoon season, the daily fire counts for a full year here, this. And now let's look at the spatial region. This is the spatial extent. And then if you look at some of the molecules, you can see in the pre-harvest time where you have the blue markers denoting the data. In the post-harvest time, you have the red markers denoting the data. This is hour of the day. This is the chemical marker for biomass burning. Sure enough, you see higher values of this because this emission activity is more stronger in this post-harvest period. Meteorological conditions are very similar. You have even human carcinogen benzene concentrations increasing. Recollect, I said 1.6 ppb as the annual average that should not be exceeded. But at this time, we always have more than that. And then you have isocyanic acid. This is a molecule that has been discovered by our research group to be present in these fires. And what you see here is it has both a primary fire emission source in the evening time, but also like ozone in the middle of the day, a photochemical source. And why this is so toxic is because it's simply a chemical relative of one of the gases that was emitted during the Bhopal gas tragedy, namely methyl isocyanate. And just at 1 ppb of exposure, concentration exposure, it can undergo denature several proteins involved in eye vision and arthritis. So you can see that, therefore, we really need to have a better idea of this. These are some of the other molecules that produce this isocyanic acid. And independently of us, people in the village clinics, they also report eye ailments. Now, at least we have one of the contributing causating factors. So now I'm almost at the end of my talk. That was about the post-monsoon season. This is the summer season when wheat residue is also burnt. And this is just to show you how it can affect the ozone. So this is where the clean refers to the pre-harvest season in summer when the fire activity is absent. This is when wheat residue is burnt, and we found that there's a 19 ppb enhancement. Now I have told you about processes, right? So this could be due to change in solar radiation, so more photochemistry. But when we looked at the radiation, there was no significant change between the two periods. When we looked at the transport, how can we look at the transport? If we filter the air masses for those air masses that spent most of their time in the past 72 hours over the region and were not coming from Iran, which is where we can also get air from if you give enough time. Then it turns out the 19 ppb enhancement increased to 28 ppb. So it's really has to be a regional activity. And then we plotted our chemical marker for biomass burning, namely acetonitrile. And sure enough, you see as a proxy of the fire emissions, it shows that a lot of the chemicals that can make ozone were emitted from that. So now you put all these processes in what we call models, chemical transport models, and then you solve. And naturally, then the question that has been burning, a burning question in uppermost in policymakers, scientists' minds alike, is how much of this burning activity that occurs in the upwind regions of Northwest India, how much of it affects the air pollution in Delhi in terms of PM 2.5? Remember, it's just PM 2.5. And so in this study, we were able to show it's only about 20% in the seasonal average. Of course, on occasions, depending on favorable meteorology, the contribution can be much higher, up to 70%, but that happens only a few days during the season. So the take-home message from here is, if we want to improve the air quality in Delhi, then we really need to ensure that we act on the local sources that are contributing to it. And this is just a picture to show you that most of the PM 2.5 is actually PM1, that is even more fine mode, which can go even deeper into the lungs. Not just the lungs, it can cross the blood-brain barrier to the bloodstream, enter the brain. And what is that made up of? Most of it is made up of organics, which are coming from oxidation and is secondary in nature. Okay, and it also has these ammonium sulfate, other inorganic ions, and chlorine. So take home message are only three. Next time you see the air quality turn bad, think about the processes at play. I'm not going to read out all of these except to stress on the third one, which is don't just be content with knowledge about bulk screening parameters like PM 2.5. They were evolved because it's easier to monitor air pollution using them. But if you want to solve the problem, you need to know what it's made up of and where it's coming from. So finally, I said atmospheric chemistry and air pollution brew the air we breathe. And if we are able to take out the air pollution part, then just like you can see in this picture from our campus, where you had a bad air quality day, my hope is we can all enjoy such clean air. So with that, I end my talk, and I'm happy to take questions. And these are all the people who and agencies that have made this work possible. I hope you learned something today.
Thank you, Vinayak. Thank you so much. We are now open for questions. People who are on Zoom, you can use the raise hand feature. And people who are watching on YouTube, you can type your questions in the chat box. Professor Jasjeet.
Hi, Vinayak. Thanks for a very nice talk. Just wanted to check whether it is possible to develop sensors to monitor pesticide use by tracking some chemical in the atmosphere. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah.
because all the crop residue which is being burnt, overall it's a bad thing, but we are monitoring it anyway. But could we look for a tracer chemical here which will help us monitor how much pesticides have been used in these crops?
Sure. So, thank you, Jasjeet. So, this is actually something where we already know a lot of the chemicals. The issue with pesticides is we would have to look for these molecular traces. May not be that easy to find them in the gas phase because they are not that volatile. But and they said they would be like some of the heavier aromatic molecules. But yes, with GCMS, there are already known molecules that one can use to trace pesticide usage and also fertilizer usage. So that is something that can be done very easily. You simply bring that to the lab, you apply it to the soil. That is one way. Then you see how how the emissions change. For example, ammonia. A lot of the gas phase ammonia is actually coming from usage of ammonium fertilizers. Pesticides, if we talk about them, then you can similarly apply them to the soil, monitor the headspace, over a crop cycle. And you can also, for this burning, because you mentioned specifically about the burning activity, you can bring that, burn it, and just like we collected the chemical fingerprints, have maybe even additional ones in addition to the ones that are known. So that's a very good idea. We should be doing it. There's just so much to do with this complex problem. So I also see it as an opportunity. And I think through this public lecture talk, I'd like to thank the Dean Outreach for this opportunity. It's very important that the citizens are made aware, because only when there is a critical mass of people in society asking the right questions will we actually get to the right solutions.
Thank you, Vinayak.
Vinayak, there is a question from one of our students, Vikas Mittal. This is on YouTube. He asked, given the present situation that we are in, the solutions for a normal person to avoid negative impact by air pollution in a short term and in long term. Your
Okay,
suggestions.
sure. So in the short term, it's like the way you can reduce exposure is I can share with you what we are doing in our home. Is You can use air purifiers at home. You can use masks when you go out. Right now, anyway, because of COVID, people are in fact mandated to wear N95 masks. So I have in fact found using these masks compared to this season and the previous seasons, where burning has anyway not decreased significantly this year relative to other years. I actually feel that. So using these devices, technology can help a lot. Now, that's the short term, right? That's really just solving it at an individual level. It's not really solving it as long term. So long term, the solutions are well known. So what I'd like to stress here is, if you look at Los Angeles and London, where some of the earliest air pollution episodes happened, I mean, at that time, Indian cities were very clean because we simply, it's most of these pollution problems are just simply a problem of scale. So today, it's not like there are less people living in London and Los Angeles. It's not that there are less cars. What has changed is the clean technology that, so essentially people need, they are emitters for four basic reasons, right? One is transportation. You have to commute to work, so you use a vehicle. Another is cooking and heating. If you're living in a cold place or a hot place, then you use a device that has emissions. So, and then cooking uh, in India, for a long time, we didn't have really access, and even today we don't have access to very clean energy sources like LPG. So people use wooden stoves. Then waste handling. Wherever you have a large agglomerate of people in a small, in a city, if you look outside, we all know that most of the waste does not actually end up in the incinerator. There are landfills, they keep smoldering, they keep accumulating. And so there are existing technologies. And then if you talk about, so now let us look at these four, how to address each of these four major emission sources, right? Due to the necessary activities. So for heating and cooking, simply make the access to cleaner energy sources more widespread, more subsidized, which the present, I think, all the governments have done this in recent years. And we actually see that also in the data in some regions. For commuting, the two-wheelers, the petrol wheelers you saw. So it's very important to have the details. If, as is now being done, instead of odd even, if people were to replace these most polluting vehicles and replace the fleet with electrical vehicles, so how that would change the air quality is that it can be actually quite massive, the improvement, because when you use an electric vehicle, you're using energy from an electrical power plant. That power plant is actually equipped with efficient scrubbers to take care of the pollution emitted from that burning of coal at the source much more efficiently than the than some other fuel source which is not used efficiently, like biomass burning. So therefore, coming down to it, in London and US, many other cities in Europe, what has been shown is by changing these specific major emission sectors with cleaner technology in the long term, one can actually bring down the air pollution levels. So NOx today is much lower than it has ever been over London and over many of these cities in the West. So it's all about having coordinated action on the ground level.
Okay, are there questions from our Zoom participants? If so, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll take questions from YouTube. No? Okay. Here are a couple of more questions. One is from Himanshu Sarhai. Can you please explain about the air purifier towers in Delhi?
Okay. So the air purifier towers, by common consensus among all air pollution experts in the world and atmospheric chemistry experts, is that it simply is not an effective solution. The reason is very simple. The reason is, given the quanta of air and the overall pollution loading present in the air, the technology that is there in these towers, that is simply think of it like this: you have so much of dirty water, to use a different analogy, that if you use a small cleaning system that has some filters, your filters at some point will get overwhelmed. And the amount of cleaning that you can accomplish using that is not possible. So in that sense, these smog towers look good for optics. They give a false sense of sense of security that something is being done. It's a visible thing, but it hasn't been shown to actually work over long periods of time effectively at all to bring down air pollution significantly.
Okay, we have a question from our Zoom participant, Varsha. Varsha, you have a question?
Yes, sir. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
First of all, good morning, sir. And sir, I would like to ask you that in winters there are instances of burning rubber tires. So my question would be like, firstly, these are generally done by people who are not so educated or are economically less privileged. So first of all, my question is there any cleaner alternative to fuel to keep cleaner fuel that keeps people warm like in winters? And the second question is, what are some while burning these tires, we know there are a lot of toxic chemicals that are released. So what is the percentage, uh, uh, how much it contributes to the present situation of air pollution?
Okay. So, to answer the first part of your question, see, for any real world solution to be effective, it has to be a practical solution. As you mentioned quite rightly, many of these people who are actually engaging in this activity, they simply do so because for them it's about surviving the next hour to beat the cold or to cook the next meal, right? So there, I think one has to be a little bit more accommodating, and that's where there are many research groups in the world. There is also one in IISER Mohali, Dr. Babil Sinha's group, for example. What it does is it looks at some of these common materials that are burned. So, by the way, rubber, Sparsha, since you're probably an IISER student, you would know it's actually a polymer of something that resembles isoprene very closely, right? Neoprene. So it's a 5 carbon atom. So that is quite reactive stuff, as you pointed out, when it's emitted. This, what they are doing is they simply try and make the combustion process more efficient. If the carbon, the hydrogen, and the other elements present in the fuel are combusted efficiently, what does that mean? It means that all the carbon goes to something like carbon dioxide, not these reduced chemicals like carbon monoxide or the other hydrocarbons, benzene, toluene, right? So if you can promote more of that uh, to happen, and you prevent this from happening, so and that the way to do that is simply to have better cooking stoves or better appliances in which you can use this fuel stock, and where you may have some primitive level of scrubbers also. So there is a lot of these now in Africa and in many parts of India. Many of these sort of hybrid cooking stoves have been launched. So that is one way to address the issue in the stock in the short term until we are able to provide access to cleaner energy sources for that section of the population. Now, your second question was about how much these toxic chemicals contribute to the air quality. So that is where I purposefully in this talk stressed on processes, right? It's very important to know the quantity of air pollution, so to say, that is emitted into the air, right? How much is of it is due to meteorological process, how much is due to chemistry in the atmosphere, how much is due to direct emission sources? If it's direct emission sources, then how much is it due to, let's say, transportation or biomass burning? Now here, what we have found on the basis of our data is the contribution, of course, will vary depending on the specific air pollutant you're talking about. So if you're talking about PM 2.5, in this season, there is a student who's working in the ES department. She has shown in her PhD thesis work, Harshita Pawar, that actually 40% enhancement can occur due to the stubble burning within this region, right? I mentioned to you that the transported pollution from Northwest India to the air quality of Delhi, that seasonal average contribution is only 20%. But I should maybe also stress through your question that the people who are living in the place where this activity occurs on large scale, much larger scale, they are actually bearing the most severe brunt of this. So that's not 20% or less. It's actually something more like 40 for something like PM 2.5. Now, if you're talking about benzene, we've also shown that in our work that leads to an enhancement also of the order of about 50 to like a factor of 2. So that would be like 100% increase during this time of the year in some of these molecules concentrations relative to other times of the year. Okay, so this is, I hope it helps you get some sense of the numbers.
Okay. A question from Jimmy Bahulian. Jimmy says that the graphs for the two-wheeler and the four-wheeler petrol looked very similar.
Yes, I'll just.
How are you able to trace back to two-wheelers being a major source of emission during odd-even rule?
First of all, thanks, Jimmy, for paying close attention to the graph. Okay, so if you notice, then let me just flash that graph again for you. That is why I put the, yeah. So here it is. So you're right. See, both are in the end petrol, right? One is a slightly, now what you see on the y-axis is actually the normalized ratio. So therefore, this type of plot simply tells you about the type of molecules that are emitted from that particular, that are present in that particular uh, emission exhaust. Okay. It doesn't tell you about the amount. So how has this normalized ratio plot been derived? Our idea here was simply just like DNA fingerprinting, here create a chemical fingerprint where you can compare things. So for that, we simply took the compound that was emitted in the largest amount and gave that compound a ratio like a value of 1. So for example, for petrol two-wheeler exhaust, that would be toluene. Okay. And then all the other compounds are sort of divided by the concentration of the compound that was present in maximum amount. So this is a normalized ratio, hence it looks similar. But if you read this paper, this is in an open access journal. It's a society journal of the EGU, European Geosciences Union, and I can send you a copy too. There we have also reported the absolute concentration levels of these compounds present in the exhaust. And since these are two-stroke engine thing, we found a lot of, actually, in addition to these VOCs, carbon monoxide. So CO is not shown here in this plot, but carbon monoxide, as you may be aware, it actually forms this carboxyhemoglobin irreversible complex when it binds with hemoglobin in the human blood, and then it can reduce your oxygen saturation ratios in the blood. So that was present in a very high amount from this petrol. And just to complete this answer fully, this is also where it's very important that people stop getting, sort of conditioned by the scale of things. Like an object that looks bigger, if it has the right technology, might actually be emitting much less than this. So here, the specific cases, we also looked at CNG buses, publicly, large the buses that the transportation agencies use to ferry people, which was run on CNG, including one on IISER campus. We have such a bus. So the emission from that bus, believe it or not, was much lower and much cleaner, as you can see, compared to the petrol two-wheeler exhaust. So I hope that answers your question, Jimmy. It's simply, this graph doesn't give you the absolute concentration.
Given the topic, I'm sure there are lots of other questions. So maybe we'll limit to two more questions in the interest of time. Here is one question from one of our people on Zoom. By when will the crop yield reduce so much that farmers would willingly change from stubble burning to some other means?
Okay, that's a very, very tricky question to answer. See, if you look at the ozone calendar plot, right, then you have to see the ozone exceedance. So there are, first of all, crops. I'm just trying to find that slide. I anticipated this question actually. There are some crops that are more sensitive to ozone exposure than others. So for example, wheat is more sensitive generally than many of the paddy cultivars. Now, what also is very important in this is, again, in the details. So ozone in the air does not mean that the ozone has, that there in the air, all of it has gone into the plant. The way the plant uptakes it is through the stomata. And when the stomata are open, only then can that process of uptake happen. Now, it turns out that during the growth cycle of a particular crop, there are certain stages like the grain filling stage or the flowering stage, where they are more susceptible to the ozone damage. And that then stunts their eventual growth. So in terms of numbers, I think we don't need to weigh in terms of the cost to the Indian GDP. there's a study that was done by one of our own scientists. Wait, so first let me show you what this global picture shows. So this is just for, it does not include paddy. These are for the, like I said, ozone sensitive crops. So for them, AOT 40, so 40 ppb is considered to be a phytotoxic dose. Beyond that, any exposure to concentrations of ozone in ambient air exceeding 40 ppb can cause crop yield loss. And so you see the numbers here. This is the crop production loss in million metric tons. You can see how much it is over India, China, and some other parts like US. And here, when that is converted to an economic value, so this is a study done by Agneri et al., you can see the amount is quite staggering. And if I remember correctly, there's another study done by Dr. Babel Sinha's group here in IISER Mohali, which actually put it
Sorry,
at a
Vinayak.
significant.
Sorry to
Sorry.
butt in.
Yeah.
Your screen is not shared, so we can't really see.
I'm sorry. Okay, just a second. Thanks, Prasad. Just a minute. I have to go to the Zoom. Just a second. So I hope it was visible at least till the last one. So just a second.
Yeah, now we can see.
Okay, so let me show you that graph. Yeah, this is the graph. Can you see it? So this was a study where the top panel shows the crop yield production loss in million metric tons, and then the economic value associated with that. So this has been done some years ago. Now the numbers have actually been improved, and all the while, the more we know about this, the more we realize that this is actually a very serious thing. And it may gladden you to know that Punjab Agricultural University taking note of this effect, because in the actual environment there are so many confounders. When you grow a crop, how do you know that the crop yield went down just because of the bad air? Or how much of it due to the bad air, how much of it due to, let's say, the soil or the water availability or the fertilizer usage or pests. So in order to address that, there are both like open top control chamber studies, and then there are like process-based models that model the uptake of the ozone into the plant, and then look at how the thing for different cultivars, what's the sensitivity, the dose exposure relationship is established. Yeah, so this is, I think it's a few percentage of the Indian GDP already now. And I'm just trying to look if I have that slide. There was, just give me a second. Otherwise, I can send across that paper to you. It was by Dr. Babel Sinha's group, which calculated the economic crop yield. And just the take-home message is the numbers were already worrisome, that it would, if you mitigate this, if you could mitigate this, the amount that you would win would be far more than the investment required to mitigate it. Yeah, okay.
So, Vinayak, maybe one last question.
Sure, I'm happy to take questions.
And this is, well, I'm generalizing the question. The question is in a slightly different form.
Yeah.
The generalized form of the question is, do you think there is a relationship between the rise in COVID infections and pollution?
Okay. Yeah. See, there have been a couple of studies also from some very reputed, well, I would say like high profile institutions in the US, which published a report on that. Now, if you're asking for my personal take on it, then I think my one line summary is, I don't think we know enough to actually tell how significant the risk is. But in terms of a causative cause-effect relationship, there is a possibility. So how would that work? So there are, let me just explain in two very different ways. This can actually, air pollution or aerosol particles could potentially, I'm using the words very carefully, potentially affect COVID spread. So first thing is, it's very unlikely in the outdoor that you would get infected with COVID due to high air pollution. For that, you actually need to be in close contact with an infected individual. So the virus has to be there. Okay. Now, the part where there is a causal link, qualitatively at least, is if you recollect, then I showed you this diagram of the lung where we breathe in more than 10,000 liters per day. That was the starting slide. So here, Prasad, is this visible on the screen?
Not yet.
Okay. So yeah. So here, see what happens is there are alveoli, so-called air sacs within the lungs, and the air that we breathe in, the oxygen in that actually goes through the alveoli, then into the through capillaries into the bloodstream, which then in the form of hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin, then goes to the heart and that pumps it to the organs. That's something I mentioned. Now, if you have for carbon monoxide, we know this. If air has air pollution, carbon monoxide is one of the criteria air pollutants. If there is a lot of that, then that can actually form some of the form an irreversible complex, namely carboxyhemoglobin instead of oxyhemoglobin. Thereby, it can affect the transport of oxygen availability within the body. So if you are already an infected person, you already have COVID, then air pollution through this causal link could potentially affect your recovery rate, because it is known that oxygen saturation ratio is dipping below 95%. Below 90% is one of the ways in which mortality happens when you have COVID. So in that sense, it can increase the vulnerability. Okay, that's one part. Now, the other part is within indoor settings. This is more sound footing. We have a lot more data and a lot more research papers, and many countries like Germany have already accepted this, which is that in an indoor setting, if you want to minimize the risk of contracting COVID from people who are there in the same room as you, then the exchange of air within the room, the ventilation rate should be appreciable, meaning 2-3 exchange, full air of the room should be exchanged fairly rapidly. Why is that necessary? Because based on the super spreader events, based on the anecdotal evidence, but also based on findings where people have detected COVID virus on aerosol particles. I mentioned to you that we inhale and exhale, if you're not an athlete, just a normal sedentary guy like me, 20 times per minute. So with every exhalation, you also emit these small aerosol particles. And these aerosol particles have a longer residence time. They can float around in that indoor room for half an hour to an hour. If there are many people in the same room locked up with you, the air is not being exchanged. And if one of them happens to be infected, then it is possible to build up a dosage within that room, where then the next person, the other person who is unaffected, when he inhales that same air, then he may actually have enough inhalation exposure dosage to actually get infected with COVID. So that is more direct. So that's why wearing the mask, as the government of India has said, that's where this distance, because these aerosol particles, the dosage that you will receive decreases fairly rapidly when you have a distance from the next individual. But the main problem is if the ventilation in these settings is not strong enough, then there can still be appreciable accumulation. And there are many such events from nightclubs, pubs, bars, churches. It doesn't really discriminate where this sort of thing seems to have happened and has been reported. So that, I think, covers for you both indoor air quality and outdoor air pollution, how that can affect COVID transmission, spread, and susceptibility.
Thank you, Vinayak. I'm sure there are other questions. And if your question is not answered and if not been able to pose your question, please email them to us. We'll pass it on to Dr. Vinayak and we'll get back to you with answers. So I want to thank Dr. Vinayak for a very nice talk. Thank you so much. I should thank my two other colleagues, Dr. Amit and Dr. Mahua, who have been working in the background to make sure all this runs smoothly. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. See you in the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prasad. Thank you, Amit, and thank you, Mahua. Thank you.